Section 57 of the early Diary of Frances Burney, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Newton House, St Martin's Street, Leicester Fields, October the 18th. My father very much recovered and myself left Chessington 10 days ago. We came immediately to this house, which we propose calling Newton House, or the Observatory, or something that sounds grand, as Sir Isaac's identical observatory is still subsisting, and we show it to all our visitors as our principal lion. I am very much pleased with the mansion. The first opera of the season was performed last Tuesday. The morning before, Mrs. Brooke called here and very civilly invited my mother, Susie and me to her box. We were very desirous to hear the new singer, Razzini, of whom my father has said so much in his German tour, and we agreed to wait upon Mrs. Brooke about 7. Accordingly, we went. Her house in Market Lane, by means of divers turnings and windings, has a passage to the Opera House. We intended to have sat in her box and have seen only her, but when we went, we found she was upstairs with Mrs. Yates, and she immediately asked us to go upstairs with her. This we declined, but she would not be refused, and we were obliged to follow her. We were led up a noble staircase that brought us to a most magnificent apartment, which is the same that belonged to the famous Heidegger, footnote the manager of the Haymarket, back to main text, and since his time has always been the property of the head manager of the opera. Here we saw Mrs. Yates seated like a stage queen, surrounded with gay courtiers and dressed with the utmost elegance and brilliancy. What most provoked me was that, though our visit was only to Mrs. Brooke, yet as we entered the room, our names were announced in an audible voice. All I can comfort myself with is that it was only at the Opera House that we met, and that of late years Mrs. Yates has had no harm said of her. Mrs. Yates, to a very fine figure, joins a very handsome face, though not now in her première jeunesse, but the expression of her face is infinitely haughty and hard. With an overdone civility, as soon as our names were spoken, she rose from her seat hastily and rather rushed towards us than merely advanced to meet us. But I doubt not it was meant as the very pink of politeness. As to poor Mr. Yates, he presumed not to take liberty in his own house to act any other part than that of waiter, in which capacity he arranged the chairs. We were not absolutely seated when the door was opened by an officer. Mrs. Yates again started from her seat and flew to receive him, crying, "General Cholmondeley, I am happy to see you." Then turning to her Jerry, "Mr. Yates, pray get the gentleman a chair." Mr. Yates obeyed. Then we rose to go to the opera. We were to sit in a box by ourselves. Miss Burney to Mr. Crisp, St. Martin's Street, Thursday night. I have seen Oh My, and if I am, as I intend to be, very minute in my account, will you shake hands and be friends? Yes, you little devil, you, so to business and no more words. Very well, I obey. You must know then, in the first place, that glad as I was to see this great personage, I extremely regretted not having you of the party, as you had half promised you would be, and as I am sure you would have been extremely well pleased, and that the journey would have more than answered to you. But the notice was so extremely short it was impossible. Now to facts. My brother went last Monday to the play of Isabella at Drury Lane. he sat in one of the upper boxes, from whence he spied Omai and Mr. Banks, upon which he crossed over to speak to his friend. Omai received him with a hearty shake of the hand, and made room for him by his side. Jem asked Mr. Banks when he could see him to dinner. Mr. B. said that he believed he was engaged every day till the holidays, which he was to spend at Hinchinbrook. However, on Tuesday night, very late, there came a note which I would write down. It was directed to my brother. Omai presents his compliments to Mr. Burney, and if it is agreeable and convenient to him, he will do himself the honour of dining with Mr. Burney tomorrow. But if it is not so, Omai will wait upon Mr. Burney some other time that shall suit him better. Omai begs to have an answer, and that if he is to come, begs Mr. Burney will fetch him. Early on Wednesday morning, Jem called at Mr. Banks with my father's compliments to him and Dr. Solander, and begging their company also, but they were engaged at the Royal Society. Mr. Strange and Mr. Hayes, at their own motion, came to dinner to see our guest. We did not dine till 4, but Omai came at 2, and Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander brought him in order to make a short visit to my father. They were all just come from the House of Lords, where they had taken Omai to hear the King make his speech from the throne. For my part, I had been confined upstairs for 3 days. However, I was much better and obtained leave to come down, though very much wrapped up and quite a figure. But I did not choose to appear till Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander were gone. I found Omai seated upon the great chair and my brother next to him, and talking Otaheite as fast as possible. You cannot suppose how fluently and easily Jem speaks it. Mamma and Susie and Charlotte were opposite. As soon as there was a cessation of talk, Jem introduced me and told him I was another sister. He rose and made a very fine bow, and then seated himself again. But when Jem went on and told him that I was not well, he again directly rose, and muttering something of the fire in a very polite manner, without speech, insisting upon my taking his seat, and he would not be refused. He then drew his chair next to mine, and looking at me with an expression of pity, said, "Very well, tomorrow morrow." I imagine he meant, "I hope you will be very well in 2 or 3 morrows." And when I shook my head, he said, "No? Oh, very bad." When Mr. Strange and Mr. Hayes were introduced to him, he paid his compliments with great politeness to them, which he has found a method of doing without words. As he had been to court, he was very fine. He had on a suit of Manchester velvet lined with white satin, a bag, lace ruffles, and a very handsome sword which the King had given to him. He is tall and very well made, much darker than I expected to see him, but has a pleasing countenance. He makes remarkable good bows, not for him, but for anybody, however long under a dancing master's care. Indeed, he seems to shame education, for his manners are so extremely graceful, and he is so polite, attentive, and easy, that you would have thought he came from some foreign court. He is tall, swarthy, and young, extremely well made, and a fine figure, and though by no means handsome, he has a good and pleasing countenance. Footnote: Sir Joshua Reynolds painted a fine portrait of Omai. Back to main text. You will think that I speak in a high style, but I assure you there was but one opinion about him. At dinner I had the pleasure of sitting next to him, as my cold kept me by the fire. The moment he was helped, he presented his plate to me, which, when I declined, he had not the overshot politeness to offer all round, I have seen some people do, but took it quietly again. He ate heartily and committed not the slightest blunder at table, neither did he do anything awkwardly or ungainly. He found by the turn of conversation and some wry faces that a joint of beef was not roasted enough, and therefore when he was helped he took great pains to assure Mamma that he liked it, and said 2 or 3 times, "Very good, very good." It is very odd, but true, that he can pronounce the TH as in thank you, and the W as in well, and yet cannot say G, which he uses a D for. But I now recollect that in the beginning of a word as George he can pronounce it. He took a good deal of notice of Dick, yet was not quite so well pleased with him as I had expected him to be. During dinner he called for some drink. The man, not understanding what he would have, brought the porter. We saw that he was wrong. However, Omar was too well bred to send it back. He took it in his hand, and the man then brought him the small beer. He laughed and said, 2. However, he sent off the small beer as the worse of the 2. Another time he called for port wine. And when the bread was handed, he took 2 bits and laughed and said, 1, 2. He even observed my abstinence, which I think you would have laughed at, for he turned to me with some surprise when dinner was almost over and said, "No wine?" Mr. Hayes asked him through Jem how he liked the King and his speech. He had the politeness to try to answer in English and to Mr. Hayes, and said, "Very well, King George." After dinner, Mamma gave the King for a toast. He made a bow and said, "Thank you, madam," and then tossed off, "King George." He told Jem that he had an engagement at 6 o'clock to go with Dr. Solander to see no less than 12 ladies. Jem translated this to us. He understands enough of English to find out when he is talked of in general, and so he did now, and he laughed heartily and began to count with his fingers in order to be understood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, woman, said he. When Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander went away, he said to them, "Goodbye, goodbye." He never looked at his dress, though it was on for the first time. Indeed, he appears to be a perfectly rational and intelligent man, and with an understanding far superior to the common race of us cultivated gentry. He could not else have borne so well the way of life into which he is thrown, without some practice. When the man brought him the 2 beers, I forgot to mention that in returning them, one hit against the other and occasioned a little sprinkling. He was shocked extremely, and indeed I was afraid for his fine clothes, and would have pinned up the wet tablecloth to prevent its hurting them, but he would not permit me, and by his manner seemed to entreat me not to trouble myself. However, he had thought enough to spread his handkerchief over his knee. Before 6 the coach came. Our man came in and said, "Mr. Omar's servant." He heard it at once and answered, "Very well." He kept his seat about 5 minutes after, and then rose and got his hat and sword. My father happening to be talking to Mr. Strange, Omar stood still, neither choosing to interrupt him nor to make his compliments to anybody else first. When he was disengaged, Omar went up to him and made an exceeding fine bow, the same to Mamma, then separately to everyone in the company, and then went out with Jem to his coach. He must certainly possess an uncommon share of observation and attention. I assure you everybody was delighted with him. I only wish I could have spoke his language. Lord Sandwich has actually studied it so as to make himself understood in it. His hands are very much tattooed, but his face is not at all. He is by no means handsome, though I like his countenance. The conversation of our house has turned ever since upon Mr. Stanhope and Oh My. The first, with all the advantage of Lord Chesterfield's instructions, brought up at a great school, introduced at 15 to a court, taught all possible accomplishments from an infant, and having all the care, expense, labour and benefit of the best education that any man can receive, proved, after it all, a mere pedantic booby. The second, with no tutor but nature, changes, after he has grown up, his dress, his way of life, his diet, his country, and his friends, and appears in a new world like a man who had all his life studied the graces and attended with unremitting application and diligence to form his manners and to render his appearance and behaviour politely easy and thoroughly well bred. I think this shows how much more nature can do without art than art with all her refinement unassisted by nature. If I have been too prolix, you must excuse me, because it is wholly owing to the great curiosity I have heard you express for whatever concerns Oh My. My father desires his love to you, and says that if you will but come to town, as soon as Oh My returns from Hinchinbrook, he will promise you that you shall still have a meeting with him. Footnote. This letter is endorsed by Mr. Crisp, December the 1st. Fanny appears to have sat down and written this letter of more than 7 quarto pages that very Thursday night. Back to main text. Not having opportunity of proceeding in my ingenious narration, it is laid by so long that I have now forgot all I intended to have added, and I cannot give myself the trouble of recollection, not being in a prosing humour. I shall therefore take an abrupt and rather cavalier leave of this adventure, and as I am already much in arrears with some new ones, I shall reserve all my forces for those by way of amende honorable. To whom? Why, to myself, that is, to nobody. Hey-ho, poor me. Are nobody and I one and the same person? End of section 57. End of The Early Diary of Frances Burney, Volume 1.